Charles Montgomery stood by the expansive floor-to-ceiling window in his penthouse office, staring blankly at the Manhattan skyline. To anyone else, he was the image of success, a powerful businessman, founder, and CEO of one of the largest real estate empires in New York. But behind the sharp suit and the commanding presence was a man haunted by memories, weighed down by a past that refused to let go. It had been 7 years since Amelia, his wife, had died in that car crash. 7 years since his world had come crashing down. The accident had been shrouded in mystery. No witnesses, no clear cause. Just an icy road on a late winter evening and a mangled car at the bottom of a ravine. The police said it was an accident. Charles wanted to believe them, but deep down, something always felt wrong. Every time he thought about that night, a knot tightened in his stomach. "Sir, the board meeting is about to start," said Thomas, his ever-loyal assistant, breaking Charles out of his reverie. Charles nodded, but didn't move immediately. The routine was what kept him functioning. Meetings, deals, contracts. Everything was carefully orchestrated to keep him from thinking too much. He turned slowly, adjusting his tie, and walked towards the conference room, his mind already slipping into business mode. It was the only thing that made sense now. But despite the layers of work he buried himself under, the silence in his life had become deafening. He had no friends to speak of, no family left, and certainly no love. His only companion was his grief, which had settled into the corners of his soul like a permanent resident. The meeting was a blur of numbers, charts, and projected growths. Charles gave orders, made decisions, and signed papers, but his mind wasn't there. It hadn't been for a long time, not since Amelia. After the meeting, Charles returned to his office, leaning heavily against his desk. He opened the top drawer and pulled out a small, worn photograph of Amelia. Her smile was radiant, her eyes alive with joy. Charles traced his finger over the image, as if he could bring her back by sheer will. "I'm so sorry, Amelia," he whispered. "I should have been with you that night." There was a knock at the door, but Charles ignored it. He wasn't ready to deal with anyone right now. He slid the photo back into the drawer and locked it away, as he had done 1,000 times before. Only then did he stand, straighten his suit, and open the door. "Mr. Montgomery?" Thomas stood there, a nervous look on his face. "It's about the project on 52nd Street. There's an issue with the permits. They need your approval." Charles nodded curtly. "Send me the papers. I'll look them over." He didn't really care about the project, not anymore. Nothing seemed to matter since that night. But work was all he had left, and so he clung to it like a lifeline. Later that evening, as Charles left the office, the city was bustling around him. Taxis honked, people rushed by, and the lights of New York twinkled in the early evening sky. He walked the same route he did every day, down Park Avenue, towards his waiting car. But something was different this time. As he crossed the street, distracted by his thoughts, he didn't notice when his wallet slipped from his coat pocket, falling unnoticed to the sidewalk behind him. It would be a small mistake, one that would change everything. Charles strode down the sidewalk, oblivious to the world around him. His mind was miles away, lost in the endless stream of thoughts about meetings, reports, and the hollow ache that never seemed to leave. The black town car waited at the curb, engine humming quietly as his driver stood by, ready to whisk him away to the empty solitude of his penthouse. He reached for the door handle when a voice behind him called out, hesitant yet clear. "Excuse me, sir." Charles paused, his hand frozen mid-motion. He didn't recognize the voice. He turned around slowly, eyes narrowing as they focused on a young girl, standing a few feet away, her breath misting in the cold evening air. She was small, probably no more than 16, with a tattered jacket that looked 2 sizes too big. Her dark hair fell messily around her face, and her wide, brown eyes were fixed on him with an intensity that startled him. She held something in her hand, his wallet. "You dropped this," she said, her voice a mixture of nerves and determination. She held the wallet out, stepping forward cautiously. For a moment, Charles just stared at her, blinking as if trying to process what was happening. It had been years since someone outside his business world had spoken to him directly, let alone with such an earnest gesture. His eyes flicked to the wallet in her hand. He hadn't even realized it was missing. "Thank you," Charles finally said, his voice stiff and formal as he reached for it. Their fingers brushed for a brief second as he took the wallet from her, and something in that simple touch made him pause. He looked at her again, more closely this time. She was thin, too thin for someone her age, with shadows under her eyes that hinted at a hard life. There was something familiar in her face, something he couldn't quite place. But then again, New York was full of people with sad stories. "It's nothing," she mumbled, shuffling her feet awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable with his lingering gaze. Charles opened the wallet briefly, out of habit, checking if anything was missing. That's when he saw it. The picture, Amelia's picture, tucked carefully in the corner where it had been for years. He froze, his heart clenching painfully as the familiar image of her smiling face stared back at him. "You know her." The words cut through the air, sharp and unexpected. Charles blinked, his gaze snapping up to the girl, who was now staring at the photo in his wallet with wide, disbelieving eyes. "What?" Charles said, his voice suddenly tight. He closed the wallet, instinctively shielding the photo from her view. "What did you just say?" "I know her," the girl repeated, a strange edge in her voice now. She took a step closer, her eyes not leaving the spot where the photo had been. "That woman? I've seen her before." Charles felt his pulse quicken. It was impossible. This girl was mistaken. Amelia was dead. Dead. No one could know her. He shook his head, trying to compose himself, but the girl didn't stop. "She's my mom," she said, her voice trembling now, as if she herself couldn't believe the words coming out of her mouth. "That woman in the picture. She's my mom." The world around Charles seemed to tilt. He took a step back, struggling to breathe as a wave of confusion and anger washed over him. This girl, this complete stranger, was claiming to know his wife? To be her daughter? "That's not possible," Charles said coldly, his voice low and dangerous. "You must be mistaken." But the girl didn't back down. She looked up at him, her face pale, but her expression stubborn. "I'm not wrong. I've seen her. I've lived with her my whole life until she disappeared." Charles stared at her, his heart pounding so loudly in his chest he could barely think. Disappeared? What was this girl talking about? Amelia hadn't disappeared. She had died. He had buried her. He had mourned her. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but my wife has been dead for 7 years, Charles said, his voice hardening. "She died in a car accident." The girl's face twisted into something between frustration and desperation. "No," she said, shaking her head vigorously. "She didn't. I swear to you, she's alive. I saw her. She raised me. Her name is Amelia Matthews." Charles's entire body went numb. Amelia Matthews. His wife had never gone by that name. But it was possible, wasn't it? That she had used a different last name? His mind raced, a million thoughts tangling together. It couldn't be true. It couldn't. And yet, the girl stood before him, speaking with a conviction that made his skin crawl. "Come with me," Charles said abruptly, his voice hoarse. Without waiting for a response, he motioned to the town car. "We need to talk." The girl hesitated for a moment, uncertainty flickering across her face. But then she nodded, slowly stepping toward the car. Charles opened the door for her and followed her in, his mind spinning in disbelief. As the car pulled away from the curb, the silence between them was thick and suffocating. Charles leaned forward, his fingers gripping the edge of his seat. He needed answers, and he wasn't going to stop until he got them. The interior of the town car was silent, save for the hum of the engine as it navigated through the bustling streets of New York. Charles sat rigidly, his fingers clasped together tightly, his mind racing with a mixture of disbelief and confusion. Across from him, the girl, Lily, as she had introduced herself, sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, nervously glancing out of the window and then back at Charles. Charles stared at her, barely able to reconcile what she had just told him. Could it be true? Could Amelia have survived that night? Could she have faked her death? And this girl, this homeless teenager sitting in his car, could she really be his wife's daughter? His wife's secret daughter? The thought was absurd, Yet something in Lily's eyes, something about the way she had spoken, had struck a chord in him. He didn't know whether it was the desperation in her voice or the unshakable certainty with which she had said Amelia's name, but it was enough to make him need answers. "We'll go somewhere quiet," Charles said, his voice low, breaking the tense silence. "I need to hear everything." Lily nodded but didn't speak. Her eyes were darting around nervously, as if she expected someone to come for her at any moment. Charles could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy, as if they were both on the edge of something neither of them truly understood yet. They arrived at a small, dimly lit cafe on the corner of Fifth Avenue, one of Charles's private spots, where he could think without being disturbed by prying eyes. As they stepped inside, the smell of coffee and baked goods filled the air, but neither of them seemed to notice. Charles motioned to a booth in the far corner, where they could sit away from the few other patrons scattered throughout the cafe. Lily hesitated for a second before sliding into the seat across from him. Charles ordered 2 coffees, though he had no appetite for it. He leaned forward, his eyes locked on Lily, who seemed to shrink under his intense gaze. "Start from the beginning," Charles said quietly, but firmly. "You claim to know my wife, Amelia. You say she's your mother. I want to know everything. Now." Lily swallowed hard, nervously twisting a strand of her hair between her fingers. She took a deep breath and finally began to speak, her voice soft but steady. "I didn't always live on the streets," she said, her eyes flickering with memories. "I had a home, a mother. Her name was Amelia. We lived in a small town upstate. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She worked at a bookstore, and I went to school like any other kid." She paused, looking down at the table. "But she was always afraid. She never told me why. She didn't talk about her past, and I knew better than to ask, but I could see it in her eyes. There was something she was running from, something she was hiding." Charles felt a coldness spread through him as he listened, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. Amelia had never been afraid, not in the years they had been together. She was strong, confident, unshakable. At least, that's what he had believed. But the way Lily described her now, it was like she was talking about a different person entirely. "One day, she disappeared," Lily continued, her voice faltering slightly. "I was 12. She had been acting strange for weeks, more anxious than usual. Then one night, I woke up and she was gone. No note, no explanation. I waited for her to come back, but she never did. I didn't know what to do. I had no one else, no family. So, I ran away, thinking maybe I could find her, but..." Lily's voice cracked, and she quickly wiped away a tear. "I never did." Charles leaned back, the weight of her words sinking in. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions: anger, confusion, disbelief. How could any of this be true? If Amelia had survived, why hadn't she come to him? Why had she left? And this girl, Lily, if what she was saying was true, Amelia had hidden an entire life from him. But why? "Why are you telling me this now?" Charles asked, his voice cold and measured. "What made you think to come to me?" Lily looked at him, her eyes wide and full of fear. "Because of the photo in your wallet," she said softly. "I've been living on the streets for a while now, and when I saw that picture fall out, I knew it was her. I recognized her immediately. I didn't believe it at first, but when I saw you, I had to say something. I had to know if you knew where she was. If you knew what happened to her." Charles clenched his jaw, the questions swirling in his head multiplying by the second. He opened his wallet, pulling out the photograph of Amelia again, staring at her familiar smile. It was the same photo he had carried with him for years, the same one he had kissed goodbye when they lowered her casket into the ground. "She's not alive," Charles said firmly, though his voice trembled ever so slightly. "She died in a car accident. I was there. I buried her." Lily shook her head, her expression desperate. "No, you're wrong. I know what I'm saying sounds insane, but I swear I'm telling you the truth. Amelia is my mother. She's alive. I don't know why she left me or why she disappeared, but I know she's not dead. I can feel it." Charles's mind raced. Could she really be telling the truth? Could Amelia have somehow survived and faked her death to protect This girl? His heart was pounding in his chest, the possibility too wild to comprehend. If what Lily was saying was true, then everything he thought he knew about the woman he loved was a lie. He could feel the walls of certainty he had built around himself begin to crack. Look, Lily continued, her voice more controlled now, I don't want anything from you. I just want to know if you've heard anything. Anything that could help me find her. Charles stared at her, feeling an unfamiliar sensation creeping in. Hope. What if Amelia really was alive? What if there had been some reason, some twisted explanation for all of this? I'll find out the truth, Charles said quietly, more to himself than to Lily. If Amelia is alive, I'll find her. Lily's eyes widened slightly, hope flickering there for the first time. You believe me? I don't know what to believe, Charles admitted, his voice steady but uncertain. But I'm going to find out. The weight of his words hung in the air between them. Charles Montgomery, the man who had once thought he had lost everything, now had a new mission. And it began with finding out whether the woman he had loved for so long was still alive, and why she had kept such a dangerous secret from him. Charles Montgomery sat alone in his office, the weight of Lily's words still pressing down on him. He stared blankly at the city skyline, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across his desk. His mind was consumed by one burning question. Could Amelia really be alive? The idea gnawed at him, impossible to shake. He had spent years trying to come to terms with her death, building his life back around the gaping hole she had left. Yet here he was, questioning everything. What if Lily was right? What if Amelia had faked her death? And more terrifyingly, what if she had done it to protect herself and this girl from something or someone? It was a thought that made his skin crawl. The Amelia he knew would never abandon him. But the Amelia Lily described, an anxious, fearful woman, was a stranger to him. He needed answers, and there was only one way to get them. Picking up his phone, Charles dialed a number he hadn't used in years. The line rang twice before a gruff voice answered. Who's this? It's Charles Montgomery, he said, his tone clipped. I need you to look into someone. There was a pause, followed by a low chuckle. Charles, it's been a while. You sure you want to go down this road? I don't have a choice, Charles replied, his voice steely. I need you to find out everything you can about a girl named Lily Matthews. And I need you to look into my wife's accident again. The man on the other end of the line, a private investigator named Sullivan, sighed, but there was no mistaking the interest in his voice. Your wife's accident? After all these years? Just do it, Charles said sharply, not in the mood to explain the convoluted mess he had found himself in. Find out everything. I'll pay whatever it takes. All right. I'll get started right away. Send me what you've got. Charles hung up without another word, a sense of grim determination settling over him. Sullivan had been his go-to investigator back in the early days of his empire, digging up dirt on rivals and uncovering shady deals when necessary. If anyone could find out the truth, it was him. But now came the hard part, waiting. 2 days later, Charles was sitting in the same spot, his nerves fraying as he waited for Sullivan's call. The hours had dragged on, each one more agonizing than the last, his mind running through every possible scenario. What if Lily was lying? What if she was just another con artist, playing on his grief to get something out of him? But then again, what if she wasn't? The phone rang, cutting through the silence of his office like a knife. Charles snatched it up, his heart pounding in his chest. Sullivan? He asked, his voice tight with anticipation. I've got something for you, Sullivan replied, his tone more serious than usual. This girl, Lily Matthews, well, she's not just some random kid. I dug into her background, and it checks out. She's been on the streets for a few years now, but before that, she lived upstate, just like she said. And here's where it gets interesting. Her mother was registered under the name Amelia Matthews. Charles felt his heart skip a beat. He gripped the phone tighter, his knuckles turning white. Amelia Matthews, he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. You're sure? Positive, Sullivan said. There's more. Her school records list her mother as a single parent. No father on file, but the dates line up. If your wife was living under that name, it's possible she was using it to hide. From what? I'm not sure yet. Charles was silent, the pieces starting to fall into place in his mind. Amelia had been hiding. But from whom? And why? What about the accident? Charles asked, his voice trembling slightly. What did you find? Sullivan hesitated, and Charles could almost hear the tension crackling over the line. That's where things get strange, Sullivan said slowly. The accident report looks clean at first glance, but when I dug deeper, I found a few things that don't add up. There's no detailed investigation, no autopsy report filed. Just a few photos of a car wreck and a closed case. It's almost like someone wanted to make sure there were no questions asked. Charles felt a chill run down his spine. What are you saying? I'm saying someone went to great lengths to bury this, Sullivan replied grimly. Whether that was to protect her or to cover something up, I can't say. But it smells rotten. If I didn't know better, I'd say she could have walked away from that crash. The world seemed to tilt beneath Charles as he processed Sullivan's words. Amelia might have survived. The thought was too overwhelming to fully grasp. If she had survived, why hadn't she come back to him? Why had she chosen to disappear instead? And Lily? Charles asked, his throat dry. Is she really her daughter? Every record I could find says so, Sullivan confirmed. The dates, the locations, they all match. Whoever this girl is, she's telling the truth. Charles closed his eyes, trying to steady himself as the reality of the situation hit him. Lily was telling the truth. Amelia was alive, had been alive, at least for some time after the accident, and she had a daughter. But why hadn't she come back to him? What could possibly have driven her to stay hidden? Keep digging, Charles said after a long pause. I need to know everything. Where she went, who she was running from. Don't stop until you find her. You got it, Sullivan replied. But be careful, Charles. This whole thing smells like trouble. If someone's been keeping this secret for that long, they're not going to be happy about you poking around. I'm not stopping until I know the truth, Charles said, his voice hard. No matter what it takes. After the call, Charles sat in his office, the air heavy with tension. The idea that Amelia might have been alive all these years stirred something deep inside him. A mixture of anger, hope, and betrayal. But now, there was something else too. Danger. If Amelia had gone into hiding, if she had faked her death, then it meant she had been afraid of something. Something powerful enough to make her leave her life behind. And now, by starting this investigation, Charles was stepping into that same web of secrets and lies. His phone buzzed again, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from Sullivan. One more thing. You're not going to like this. Amelia might not have been running alone. Looks like your company's involved too. Be careful. Charles stared at the message, a sick feeling rising in his stomach. His company? How could his business be connected to this? He had always prided himself on running a clean operation, steering clear of the underhanded deals that plagued so many in his industry. But now, it seemed that his own empire might have played a role in driving his wife away. Charles stood up, pacing the length of his office. His entire world was unraveling, one thread at a time. He had spent years building this life, this fortress of power and wealth, but now it seemed like it had been built on lies. There was no turning back now. He had to know the truth. Charles Montgomery sat at his desk, staring at the cryptic message from Sullivan that now seemed to taunt him from his phone screen. Your company's involved? The words rang in his mind, heavy with implications. His hands trembled as he set the phone down, trying to digest the reality he had just been thrust into. His business, his life's work, was somehow connected to Amelia's disappearance. The very empire he had built with his own hands, brick by brick, might have been involved in driving his wife away, or worse, in endangering her and her secret daughter, Lily. A deep, cold dread filled his chest. He wasn't just uncovering secrets about Amelia. He was pulling at the threads of something much larger, something that threatened to consume everything he thought he knew. His gaze drifted to the window, the glittering city skyline a sharp contrast to the darkness closing in on him. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. There was no time to waste. The company he had trusted for so long, the board members he had worked with for years, any one of them could be involved in whatever conspiracy was swirling beneath the surface. But Charles wasn't a man who backed down from a challenge. He had faced cutthroat competitors, hostile takeovers, and economic crises. This was personal. If his business was tied to Amelia's disappearance, then he was walking into dangerous territory, but he had to know the truth. His pulse quickened as he realized he might be dealing with enemies closer than he had ever imagined. He quickly dialed Sullivan again. The phone rang twice before the gruff investigator picked up. "Tell me everything," Charles demanded, skipping any pleasantries. Sullivan exhaled heavily on the other end. "It wasn't easy to track down, but I found some troubling leads. There's a group, shadowy, but linked to your company. Quiet operations, off-the-books deals, hidden contracts. Looks like a network of high-level executives connected to some pretty shady business. And your wife. She was connected to it too." Charles felt his stomach twist. "How?" he asked, his voice tight. "I don't have all the pieces yet," Sullivan admitted, "but I found traces. Amelia, under the name Amelia Matthews, was involved with a series of shell companies that had ties to your firm. We're talking about something big here, Charles. Dangerous people? The kind who don't like loose ends." Charles leaned forward in his chair, trying to process the flood of information. "You're saying my company is tied to some criminal operation? And Amelia was caught in the middle of it?" "That's what it looks like," Sullivan said gravely. "It's not just your company, though. It's bigger. International. Money laundering, offshore accounts, dirty deals. I think Amelia found out something, and that's why she had to disappear. She was running. She faked her death to keep Lily safe." Charles's mind raced. He had always been meticulous about his business, never engaging in the kind of underhanded dealings that brought down so many others in his industry. But maybe, behind the scenes, others in his company hadn't been so careful. Had he been blind to it all? "Do you know who's involved?" Charles asked, his voice hardening. "Give me names." "That's the tricky part," Sullivan replied. "There's a group of board members and top-level executives tied to this, but they've covered their tracks well. I've found traces of suspicious activity linked to your CFO, Mason Klein, and a few others. They've been funneling money through subsidiaries, fronts for something much bigger. I'd bet anything that's why Amelia disappeared. She was in danger." The name Mason Klein sent a surge of anger through Charles. Mason had been with the company for over a decade, trusted, respected. He was a part of Charles's inner circle, someone he had never thought to question. The idea that Mason, or anyone else close to him, could have betrayed him, and worse, put Amelia's life in danger, made his blood boil. "What now?" Charles asked, his jaw clenched. "I can dig deeper, but you need to be careful," Sullivan warned. "These aren't the kind of people who sit back while you expose their secrets. If they realize you're onto them, things could get dangerous, fast." Charles leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. The weight of the situation bore down on him like a vice. He had been walking in the dark for years, blind to the forces operating within his own company. He had to be strategic. One wrong move, and he could end up not only losing his company but his life. "I'll handle it," Charles said, his voice firm with determination. "Find out everything you can about Mason and the others. I want every detail. And Sullivan, find Amelia. I don't care what it takes. Find her before they do." "Got it," Sullivan replied before hanging up. Charles sat in the dimly lit conference room later that evening, staring at the faces of his board members as they discussed mundane business matters. His mind, however, was elsewhere. He couldn't help but scan the room, his eyes flicking from one executive to the next. Mason Klein sat near the head of the table, his expression calm and professional as he reviewed financial reports. But now, to Charles, that calm demeanor seemed sinister. Charles had known Mason for years, had trusted him with his company's finances. But now, every word out of Mason's mouth felt like a lie. Was he one of them? One of the men who had forced Amelia to vanish? "Charles, your thoughts." Mason's voice broke through his thoughts, jolting him back to the present. Charles blinked, his mind snapping back into focus. He looked at Mason, forcing his expression to remain neutral. "It's fine," he said, his voice measured. "Let's move forward with the proposal." Mason nodded, unaware of the storm brewing behind Charles's controlled exterior. The meeting continued, but Charles couldn't shake the growing suspicion that he was sitting at a table full of enemies. When the meeting finally ended, Charles stayed behind, watching as the board members filtered out one by one. Mason approached him, his face impassive. "Everything all right, Charles? You seemed distracted." Charles forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just a lot on my mind," he said coolly. Mason studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Well, let me know if you need anything. We've got a big quarter ahead." "I will," Charles replied, his voice flat. He watched as Mason turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing through the empty room. Once alone, Charles exhaled, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. The room suddenly felt suffocating, the air thick with tension. He had to be careful. He couldn't confront Mason or the others head-on. At least not yet. He needed proof, something concrete to bring them down. He pulled out his phone, typing a quick message to Sullivan. "Keep digging on Mason. I want to know every move he makes." As he stood in the empty conference room, Charles realized just how deep the conspiracy went. His wife had been running from these people for years, and now, by poking into the shadows, he was risking everything. His company, his life, and possibly Lily's. But there was no turning back now. He had already pulled the thread, and the unraveling had begun. And as Charles stared out at the city lights flickering below, he made a silent vow. He would find Amelia. He would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. And when he did, he would make those responsible pay for everything they had taken from him. The weight of the conspiracy bore heavily on Charles Montgomery's shoulders as he sat in his penthouse office late into the night. The city outside was alive with lights and sounds, but inside, all was silent, save for the occasional ticking of the wall clock. Every second that passed felt like the click of a countdown timer. He had poked the beast, and now he was waiting for it to strike back. Since his last conversation with Sullivan, Charles had been operating with a new level of paranoia. He knew too much now. About the secret dealings within his company, the hidden forces that had driven Amelia into hiding, and the dangerous people who would do anything to keep their secrets buried. He was walking a fine line between discovery and disaster, and the tension was suffocating. Across from him, Lily Matthews sat on the couch, her thin frame slouched forward as she stared at her hands. It had been days since their meeting in the cafe, and since then, Charles had made sure she stayed under the radar. She was, after all, the key to this whole mess, a living link to Amelia, and possibly the target of people far more dangerous than either of them could imagine. Lily looked up at him, her eyes tired but still sharp with the quiet resilience of someone who had spent years surviving on the streets. "Do you really think they'll come after me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Charles nodded, his expression grim. "If they know who you are, yes. These people, they don't leave loose ends." Lily swallowed hard, looking down again. The weight of her situation seemed to be sinking in. "What do we do now?" Charles stood and crossed the room, pacing near the window as he stared out at the city. He had been asking himself the same question for days. Every lead he followed seemed to unravel further, revealing more layers of deceit. But now, it wasn't just about finding Amelia. It was about staying one step ahead of those who had been keeping her hidden. "We need to find Amelia before they do," he said finally, turning to face Lily. "Whatever she's been running from, we need to get to her first. Sullivan is digging, but we have to be careful. If anyone suspects we're onto them, they'll act fast." Lily nodded, her eyes full of uncertainty. "And if they find us first?" Charles didn't answer. The truth was, he didn't know. He had spent his life controlling everything around him, but this was different. This was a battle fought in the shadows, and for the first time in years, Charles felt like he wasn't in control. The silence between them was broken by a sudden vibration from Charles's phone. He snatched it up quickly, his heart racing. It was Sullivan. "Charles, we've got a problem." Sullivan's voice was rough, and Charles could hear the urgency in his tone. "What happened?" Charles asked, his grip tightening on the phone. "They're on to you," Sullivan said bluntly. "I've been following Mason's communications, and it looks like someone flagged your recent moves. They know you've been digging around, and they're not happy. You need to be careful, Charles. Things are moving faster than I thought." A chill ran down Charles's spine. He had expected pushback, but not this quickly. "What do they know?" "Enough," Sullivan replied. "Enough to send a warning. Before Charles could respond, the line went dead. He stood there for a moment, staring at the phone in his hand, his mind spinning. A warning. The words echoed in his head, filling him with dread. He had known this would get dangerous, but he hadn't expected it to happen so soon. Whoever was behind this conspiracy wasn't going to wait for him to figure it all out. They were coming for him. Charles turned to Lily, his face set in a grim expression. "We need to leave. Now." Lily stood up, panic flashing in her eyes. "What? Where are we going?" "Somewhere safe," Charles said, already grabbing his coat and heading for the door. "We can't stay here. If they're watching us, we're not safe anymore." Just as he reached for the door handle, there was a sharp knock. Both Charles and Lily froze, their eyes locking. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. Charles felt his pulse quicken. He motioned for Lily to stay quiet, his mind racing through the possibilities. Had they found him already? Was this the warning Sullivan had talked about? "Mr. Montgomery?" A voice called from the other side of the door. "It's security." Charles hesitated, his heart hammering in his chest. Security? His private security team? It seemed unlikely. Something wasn't right. He glanced at Lily, who was standing tense, her face pale with fear. "Go to the back room," he whispered. "Stay there until I say it's safe." Lily nodded, quickly slipping away into the hallway. Charles turned back to the door, his mind running through his options. If this was a threat, he needed to handle it carefully. He reached into the desk drawer and pulled out a small handgun, a precaution he had taken years ago but had never thought he'd actually need. Taking a deep breath, Charles cracked the door open just enough to see the man standing outside. He was dressed in a security uniform, but something about him was off. His stance was too rigid, his eyes too sharp. Charles knew his security team, and this man wasn't one of them. "Is there a problem?" Charles asked, his voice calm but firm. "Just a routine check," the man said, his tone too casual. "We need to make sure everything's secure. Mind if I come in?" Charles tightened his grip on the door. He could feel the tension radiating off the man, the air thick with unspoken menace. "I'm fine," Charles said coldly. "No need for a check." The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I insist." Before Charles could react, the man pushed the door open, forcing his way inside. Charles stumbled back, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun tucked in his waistband. "Get out," Charles growled, his voice low and dangerous. The man's expression darkened as his eyes flicked to the gun in Charles's hand. "You don't want to do that," he said quietly, his tone dripping with menace. "I'm not here to hurt you, yet. I'm just here to deliver a message." Charles didn't lower the gun. "What message?" "Stop asking questions," the man said, his eyes cold and unblinking. "You've been poking around where you shouldn't. My employers don't like it." Charles's blood ran cold. This was it, the warning Sullivan had spoken of. The people behind Amelia's disappearance, behind everything, were finally making their move. "I won't stop," Charles said through gritted teeth. "Not until I find out the truth." The man chuckled, a low, mocking sound. "The truth won't help you, Montgomery. It'll only get you killed." Charles took a step forward, his eyes blazing with defiance. "Let them try." For a moment, the two men stood in a tense standoff, the air between them crackling with danger. Then, slowly, the man backed away, his smile never faltering. "Consider this your last warning," he said as he stepped toward the door. "Next time, we won't be so polite." He turned and left without another word, the door closing softly behind him. Charles stood there, his heart racing, the weight of the situation pressing down on him like a suffocating blanket. Lily emerged from the back room, her face pale with fear. "What happened? Who was that?" Charles lowered the gun, his hands still shaking. "They know we're onto them. We have to move fast. It's only a matter of time before they come back." Lily's eyes were wide, her voice trembling. "What do we do now?" Charles met her gaze, a grim determination settling in. "We find Amelia. We expose the people behind this, and we fight back." The car sped through the dark streets of New York, the rhythmic thrum of the engine doing little to calm Charles Montgomery's racing thoughts. The events of the past few hours felt like a blur, but the confrontation with the man in the security uniform played over and over in his head. He had been lucky this time. He knew that much. But luck wouldn't last long, and the next time they came for him, there would be no warning. Beside him in the back seat, Lily sat in silence, her face pale in the glow of the passing streetlights. She kept her arms wrapped tightly around herself, like she was trying to hold everything together. Charles glanced at her briefly before turning his eyes back to the road. He had gotten her into this mess, and now it was his responsibility to get her out of it. But first, they had to find Amelia. "Sullivan's working fast," Charles said, more to himself than to Lily. He clutched his phone in his hand, waiting for the investigator to call back with updates. If anyone can track down where she went, it's him. Lily didn't respond at first. Her eyes were fixed on the passing cityscape, as if the weight of everything they were caught up in was finally sinking in. After a moment, she turned toward him, her voice quiet. "What if we're too late? What if something's already happened to her?" Charles clenched his jaw, a wave of guilt washing over him. He had asked himself the same question more times than he could count, but he couldn't afford to think like that. "Not now. We'll find her," he said firmly, trying to convince himself as much as Lily. "We have to." The car came to a halt in front of a small, unremarkable building on the outskirts of Manhattan. Sullivan had chosen the location, an old safe house from his days as a private investigator. It was discreet, off the grid, and most importantly, secure. Charles and Lily stepped out of the car, the cold night air biting at their skin as they hurried inside. Sullivan was waiting for them in the small, dimly lit living room. His face was grim, his usual cocky demeanor replaced by something far more serious. He motioned for them to sit down, his eyes darting toward the door as if he expected someone to burst in at any moment. "You weren't followed?" Sullivan asked, his voice low. Charles shook his head. "No, but they've made it clear they're watching us." Sullivan let out a heavy sigh, rubbing the back of his neck. "We're running out of time. Whoever these people are, they're moving fast. I've been digging into Mason and the others, and it's worse than I thought. They've got connections everywhere. Government, law enforcement, you name it. This isn't just a few corrupt executives. This is something big." Charles leaned forward, his hands clasped together tightly. "And Amelia? Have you found anything?" Sullivan hesitated, glancing at Lily before speaking. "I've got a lead. It's not much, but it's something. After Amelia disappeared, she used a series of fake identities to move around. The last trace I could find of her was in a small town upstate. She was living under the name Anna Keller." "Anna Keller?" Lily whispered, her eyes widening. "That's the name she used when I was a kid. She told me it was her real name." Sullivan nodded, the pieces starting to fall into place. "She was careful, always staying one step ahead. But I've traced her movements to a remote cabin outside that town. She was last seen there about 6 months ago." Charles felt a surge of hope. 6 months wasn't that long ago. If Amelia had made it that far, there was a chance she was still alive, still hiding. "Where's this cabin?" Sullivan pulled out a folded map, laying it on the coffee table. He pointed to a small, near a stretch of forest, far from any major roads. "Here. It's isolated, hard to reach, which makes sense if she's still trying to stay off the radar." Charles studied the map, a sense of urgency rising within him. He needed to go there, to see for himself if Amelia was still at that cabin. But before he could speak, Sullivan held up a hand. "Hold on, Charles. You can't just go charging up there without a plan. If those people are watching you, they'll follow you straight to her." Charles bristled. He wasn't used to waiting, especially not when the stakes were this high. But Sullivan was right. If the people behind this conspiracy had gone to such lengths to bury the truth, they wouldn't hesitate to follow him and take out anyone in their way. "So, what do we do?" Lily asked, her voice breaking through the tension. "We can't just sit here and wait." Sullivan leaned back in his chair, thinking. "We need a distraction," he said slowly. "Something that throws them off your trail, makes them think you've backed off. Meanwhile, I can head up to the cabin myself, quietly. If Amelia's there, I'll bring her back. No one will see me." Charles hesitated. The thought of sitting back while someone else searched for his wife didn't sit well with him. But he knew Sullivan was right. If he went up there himself, he'd be putting Amelia in even more danger. "All right," Charles said, his voice thick with reluctance. "But you need to keep me updated. The minute you find something, you call me?" Sullivan nodded, already gathering his gear. "I'll leave at first light. You just focus on keeping a low profile. Make them think you've given up." Charles stood, pacing the length of the small room. His mind was racing, trying to find a way to channel the restless energy surging through him. Sitting around and waiting wasn't his style, but he knew there was no other option. Not yet. As the night wore on, Lily excused herself to the small bedroom, her exhaustion finally catching up to her. Charles remained awake, staring out the window, his thoughts consumed by the possibility of seeing Amelia again. Every time he closed his eyes, he imagined her, alive, scared, hiding in that cabin. He pictured her face, the sound of her voice, and the smile she used to give him in those quiet moments they once shared. And then came the darker thoughts, the questions that had been haunting him since Lily first told him she knew Amelia. Why hadn't she come to him? Why had she stayed hidden for all these years, leaving him to grieve, to think she was gone forever? What had she been running from? And more importantly, who had she been running from? Charles couldn't shake the feeling that when he finally found her, the answers might not be the ones he was hoping for. The next morning, Sullivan set off early, disappearing into the dawn with nothing but a duffel bag and a phone. Charles and Lily were left behind in the small safe house, the hours dragging by as they waited for any word from the investigator. As the day turned into night, tension filled the air. Charles paced the room, his nerves fraying with every passing minute. His phone remained silent, each hour that passed without an update weighing heavily on him. What if something had happened to Sullivan? What if they had found him before he could reach Amelia? Lily sat in the corner, her knees drawn to her chest, her eyes wide with fear. "What if we never find her?" she asked softly, her voice trembling. Charles stopped pacing, turning to face her. He could see the fear in her eyes, the same fear that had been gnawing at him for days. But he couldn't let it take hold. "Not now. We'll find her," he said, his voice steady. "We don't have a choice." Just as the words left his mouth, his phone buzzed loudly, shattering the silence. Charles grabbed it, his heart leaping into his throat as he saw Sullivan's name on the screen. "Sullivan?" Charles answered quickly, his voice taut with anticipation. "I found her," Sullivan said, his voice rough but unmistakably alive. "She's here, Charles. She's alive." Charles felt a rush of emotion. Relief, disbelief, hope. "Is she all right? Is she safe?" "She's shaken," Sullivan replied, "but she's all right. You need to come up here now. But be careful, there's more to this than we thought. You need to hear it from her." Charles's grip tightened on the phone. He had known the truth would be complicated, but hearing the fear in Sullivan's voice made him realize just how dangerous the situation had become. "We're on our way," Charles said, hanging up the phone. He turned to Lily, his heart pounding. "We're going to find your mother." Lily stood, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. "What did Sullivan say?" "He found her," Charles said, grabbing his coat. "She's alive." As Charles and Lily rushed out into the night, one thought burned in his mind. The truth was finally within reach. But whatever it was more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. The drive to the remote cabin seemed to stretch endlessly, the car cutting through the cold night like a blade. Trees blurred past the windows as Charles Montgomery gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white. Lily sat in the passenger seat, her face pale in the moonlight, eyes wide with anticipation and fear. Neither of them spoke much, the silence in the car thick with unspoken questions and emotions. Charles's mind was spinning. Amelia was alive. He repeated the words to himself, trying to grasp the enormity of it. For 7 years, he had mourned her, grieved her loss, tried to fill the void she had left behind. And all this time, she had been out there, hiding. But from what? And why hadn't she come to him? The cabin was located deep in the woods, far from the prying eyes of the city. It was a place no one would think to look, a perfect hiding spot for someone running from the shadows. Sullivan had given him directions, but even as Charles followed them, A gnawing sense of dread crept up his spine. He had thought finding Amelia would bring closure, but now he wasn't so sure. The truth, whatever it was, had sharp edges. As they approached the cabin, the road narrowed, turning into a dirt path that wound through the thick trees. The headlights of the car cast long shadows, making the forest seem alive with movement. Charles could feel his pulse quickening, his stomach tightening with each passing second. "There it is," Lily whispered, her voice barely audible. Up ahead, nestled between the trees, was the cabin. It was small, isolated, and dark. A single light flickered in one of the windows, casting a faint glow across the yard. Charles pulled the car to a stop, cutting the engine. For a moment, they just sat there in the stillness, the weight of what they were about to face hanging between them. "Are you ready?" Charles asked, turning to Lily. Lily nodded, though her hands trembled as she unbuckled her seatbelt. "I've been waiting for this my whole life." Charles stepped out of the car, the cold night air biting at his skin. He glanced around, his senses on high alert, scanning the shadows for any sign of danger. Everything seemed quiet, but after the warning from Sullivan, he knew better than to trust appearances. Whoever was behind this conspiracy, they were watching. They had already sent a warning, and Charles wasn't naive enough to think they wouldn't strike again. They approached the cabin cautiously. Charles knocked once on the door, the sound echoing in the quiet night. He could hear movement inside, footsteps, a shuffling sound. His heart pounded in his chest. After what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open, and there she was, Amelia. Charles's breath caught in his throat as he took her in. She stood in the doorway, her face older, more worn than he remembered, but unmistakably her. Her once vibrant eyes now held a shadow of fear, and there was a tension in her posture, as if she had been living on edge for too long. She stared at him, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The years, the grief, the questions, it all hung between them like a thick fog. "Charles," she whispered, her voice hoarse with disbelief. "Amelia," Charles breathed, his chest tightening as he took a step closer. She blinked, as if trying to convince herself he was real. But her gaze quickly shifted to Lily, who stood frozen a few feet behind Charles, her eyes wide with emotion. For a moment, the world seemed to stop as mother and daughter locked eyes. "Lily," Amelia whispered, her voice breaking. Lily took a step forward, her voice trembling. "Mom?" The sound of that single word, spoken with years of longing and pain, seemed to snap Amelia out of her trance. She rushed forward, pulling Lily into her arms, holding her so tightly it seemed as though she was afraid to let go. Tears streamed down both their faces as they held each other, the years of separation melting away in that one desperate embrace. Charles watched, his heart swelling with a mixture of relief and anger. Relief that they had found her, that Lily was finally reunited with the mother she had thought was lost. But anger, too, anger at the years that had been stolen from him, from both of them. He needed answers. Amelia pulled away from Lily, her eyes red and swollen, and finally turned to Charles. Her expression was filled with guilt and sorrow, as if she knew the storm of questions waiting behind his eyes. "I didn't want this," Amelia said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "I never wanted to leave you. I never wanted to disappear. But I had no choice." Charles's fists clenched at his sides, his voice cold. "You had a choice, Amelia. You could have come to me. You could have told me the truth." Amelia shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I couldn't, Charles. You don't understand. I was trying to protect you, both of you." "Protect us from what?" Charles snapped, the frustration boiling over. "For 7 years, I thought you were dead. For 7 years, I lived with the guilt of not being there for you that night. And now I find out you've been alive this whole time? Hiding? Running from something I don't even know about?" Amelia winced at his words, the pain evident in her eyes. "It wasn't just about me, Charles. It was about them. The people who were after us. They're powerful. They control everything. Money, politics, corporations. They would have killed me if I didn't disappear. And if they found out I had come back to you, they would have killed you too. I had to stay away." Charles ran a hand through his hair, trying to make sense of it all. These people, who are they? Amelia looked down, her voice trembling as she spoke. They're the ones behind your company, the ones Mason works for. They've been using your business as a front for their operations. Money laundering, trafficking, things you wouldn't believe. I found out by accident. I wasn't supposed to know, but once I did, her voice broke. Once I knew the truth, I became a threat. That's why I had to disappear. That's why I had to fake my death. Charles felt his blood run cold. Mason, the man he had trusted, the man who had stood by his side for years, was part of this? His company, the very empire he had built, was being used to fund something so dark, so twisted? It was like the ground beneath him had fallen away, leaving him in free fall. Why didn't you tell me? Charles asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I could have helped you. Amelia shook her head. I couldn't risk it, Charles. They were watching you. They still are. If you had known, you would have been in danger. And Lily. I had to protect her. That's why I stayed away. That's why I couldn't come back. Charles turned away, his hands shaking as he processed everything. His world, his life, had been built on lies. And now, he was caught in the center of a conspiracy that went deeper than he had ever imagined. But now they know, he said, his voice low and dangerous. They know I'm digging. They know I'm close. Amelia's eyes widened with fear. Charles, you have to stop. If you keep pushing, they'll come for you. They'll come for all of us. Charles turned back to face her, his expression hard. I can't stop, Amelia. Not now. I've come too far. Lily, who had been standing quietly, suddenly spoke up, her voice steady but filled with fear. Then what do we do? If they're watching us, if they're coming, how do we stop them? Charles looked between Amelia and Lily, his mind racing. He didn't have all the answers, but one thing was clear. They couldn't run anymore. The only way to end this was to expose the people behind it, to bring down the shadowy network that had taken everything from them. We fight, Charles said, his voice filled with quiet resolve. We expose them. We bring everything into the light. Amelia looked at him, her eyes filled with fear and uncertainty. It won't be easy, Charles. These people, they're ruthless. Charles nodded, the fire in his eyes growing. I know, but I'm not letting them take anything else from us. The three of them stood there in the small cabin, the weight of their decision pressing down on them. The storm was coming, and there was no turning back now. The cold morning air hung heavy as Charles, Amelia, and Lily huddled in the cabin, forming a plan that felt as fragile as the frost on the windows. The truth was out now. Amelia's disappearance, the conspiracy in his company, and the shadowy figures pulling the strings from the darkness. Everything was laid bare, but the danger was far from over. Charles knew that simply knowing the truth wasn't enough. They had to act, and soon. Amelia sat on the edge of the worn couch, her hands trembling as she clutched a cup of coffee. It was hard to believe that after all these years, she was finally with Charles again. But instead of relief, there was only fear. Fear that this reunion would be short-lived. Fear of the powerful people who still hunted her. She glanced at Lily, who had fallen asleep on a chair by the window, exhaustion finally overtaking the young girl. Amelia's heart ached for her daughter, for the life they had both lost. But now, they couldn't afford to let their guard down. Charles stood by the window, his eyes scanning the dark woods outside. His mind raced with everything Sullivan had uncovered, the names, the connections, Mason Klein, his once trusted CFO, and the cabal of executives who had been using his company as a front for their illegal activities. The network stretched far beyond anything Charles had imagined, reaching into politics, law enforcement, even international finance. They were powerful, and they would do anything to stay in control. Charles turned to Amelia. We have to bring them down, he said, his voice firm but quiet enough not to wake Lily. Amelia looked up at him, her eyes filled with fear. You don't understand what you're dealing with, Charles. These people don't just destroy lives, they erase them. If you go after them, they won't just come for you. They'll come for everyone you care about. I know, Charles said, pacing back and forth, but we can't hide forever. If we don't act, they'll find us, and then we'll have no way to fight back. Amelia sighed, the weight of the years she had spent running bearing down on her. I never wanted this. I thought disappearing was the only way to keep you and Lily safe. Charles sat down next to her, his hand resting on hers. You did what you had to do, but now we have a chance together. We can stop them. Amelia shook her head. It's not that simple. I've seen what they're capable of. They have eyes everywhere. Charles. Even Sullivan. Before she could finish, Charles's phone vibrated on the table, cutting through the tension. He grabbed it, his heart racing when he saw Sullivan's name on the screen. Sullivan, Charles said, answering quickly. Did you find anything? There was a pause on the other end, followed by Sullivan's low, gravelly voice. Yeah, I found something, and you're not going to like it. Charles's grip tightened on the phone. What is it? Mason's been meeting with some people, Sullivan said, his voice tense. High-level guys, from inside your company and beyond. They know you've been digging, and they're planning to move fast. They think you're too close to uncovering the whole operation. They want you taken out, Charles. They're coming for you. Charles felt his stomach drop. It wasn't just a warning anymore. It was a threat. A direct one. He glanced at Amelia, who was watching him with wide, fearful eyes. How much time do we have? Charles asked, his voice steady despite the dread creeping into his chest. Not long, Sullivan said. They're probably watching you already. I'm sending you everything I've found, but you need to disappear for a while. There's no telling what these guys will do once they've decided you're a threat. Charles shook his head. I can't disappear. Not now. I need to expose them. If I disappear, they win. Sullivan was silent for a moment, and when he spoke again, his tone was grave. Charles, these guys don't play by the rules. They don't care about the law, and they sure as hell don't care about taking you out quietly. If you go after them, you're going to war. Charles knew Sullivan was right, but he had made up his mind. He wasn't going to run. Not anymore. He had too much to lose. And for the first time in years, he had Amelia and Lily back. He couldn't let the people who had taken everything from him win. I'm not backing down, Charles said, his voice hard. Send me the information. I'll figure out the rest. There was a long pause on the other end before Sullivan let out a heavy sigh. All right, but watch your back, Charles. You're walking into a hornet's nest. I know, Charles replied before hanging up the phone. He turned to Amelia, his jaw clenched. They're coming for us. We need to move. Amelia's face paled. What did Sullivan say? He's found more evidence, Charles explained, standing and beginning to gather his things. Mason and his group know I'm close to figuring it all out. They're not going to wait. They're coming for me, for all of us. Amelia stood, her expression a mix of fear and determination. So, what do we do? Where do we go? Charles paused, thinking. He couldn't rely on the authorities, not with how deeply this conspiracy ran. But he wasn't without resources. His years in business had given him connections, and there were still people he could trust. We're going to fight back, Charles said, meeting her eyes. But we need to be smart. I have some allies who can help us. People who owe me favors. Amelia frowned, her worry deepening. You can't trust anyone, Charles. Not with this. I know, he said softly, but I'm not doing this alone. Sullivan is sending me everything he's found. Once we have it, we can expose them. And then what? Amelia asked, her voice trembling. Do you think they'll just let you take them down? They'll kill us, Charles. All of us. Charles took her hands, his gaze steady. I won't let that happen. I've spent too long running from them. It's time to end it. Amelia stared at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. But then she nodded, the strength in her finally breaking through. All right, she whispered. Let's do it. Hours later, they were on the move again. Sullivan had sent Charles everything. The files, the transactions, the names. It was all there, laid bare for him to see. Mason Klein, along with several other high-level executives, had been laundering money through Charles's company for years, funneling it into illegal ventures that stretched far beyond anything he could have imagined. There were bribes, payoffs, and connections to criminal networks that spanned the globe. Charles sat in the back of another black SUV, his mind racing as he scrolled through the documents on his tablet. Amelia sat next to him, silent but alert, while Lily, still shaken, leaned her head against the window, staring out at the passing landscape. "We have enough to take them down," Charles said, his voice low. "If we release this to the right people, we can expose them. But we have to do it carefully. If they find out before we make our move, we're done." Amelia nodded. "So what's the plan?" Charles was already thinking several steps ahead. He knew that simply going to the authorities wouldn't be enough. Mason's group had their claws in too many places, and he couldn't risk tipping them off. He needed to go public, but in a way that would make it impossible for them to bury the truth. "I'm going to leak the files," Charles said, his voice calm and controlled. "We'll go to the press, international outlets. Once this goes public, they won't be able to stop it. The more eyes on it, the harder it will be for them to cover it up. And after that," Amelia asked, her voice tense, "after that, we'll have to disappear. At least for a while. Once the truth is out, they'll come for us, and they won't stop until they've silenced us." Amelia's expression tightened, but she nodded in agreement. "We're already running. What's a little longer?" Charles turned to Lily, who hadn't said a word since they left the cabin. "Are you okay with this?" he asked softly. Lily blinked, pulling herself out of her daze. "I just want this to be over," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't want to run anymore." Charles's heart clenched. He knew how much she had already lost, and how much she stood to lose if this didn't go as planned. But he also knew that they couldn't run forever. This was their only shot to bring down the people who had torn their lives apart. "Neither do I," Charles said quietly. "But we have to fight one last time. Then we'll be free." As the SUV sped toward the city, Charles looked down at the files on his tablet. The evidence was there. The plan was in motion. But the danger was far from over. The people they were about to expose were powerful, and they wouldn't go down without a fight. And as Charles stared out into the dark horizon, he knew that the final confrontation was coming. One way or another, this nightmare was about to end. Charles Montgomery sat in the dimly lit hotel room, the sound of traffic humming faintly through the thick windows. The city sprawled out beneath him, oblivious to the war that was quietly brewing behind closed doors. The clock on the wall ticked slowly, each second dragging as Charles's mind raced through the events of the past few weeks. Everything had led to this moment, this final step. Beside him, Amelia paced, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as if trying to shield herself from the storm they had unleashed. Lily sat at the small table in the corner, staring blankly at her phone, her hands trembling. None of them had slept in days, the weight of what was coming hanging over them like a dark cloud. Charles looked down at his phone. He had just sent the files to the press. The evidence Sullivan had gathered, the files detailing every dirty deal, every hidden transaction. It was all there, a damning record of the corruption that had been festering inside his company for years. Mason Klein and his network of executives were about to be exposed. There would be no more running, no more hiding. But there was no turning back either. "They'll see the files any minute now," Charles said, his voice tight with anticipation. "Once the story breaks, there's no stopping it." Amelia stopped pacing and looked at him, her face pale and drawn. "And what happens to us? Once this goes public, they'll come for us, Charles." "You know they will." Charles nodded grimly. "I know, but we'll be ready." The plan was simple, yet dangerous. Sullivan had arranged for them to disappear the moment the files went live. New identities, new lives. Far away from New York, far away from the shadowy figures who had been hunting them. It wasn't the life Charles had envisioned, but it was the only way to survive. Exposing Mason and his group was only the first step. Staying alive long enough to see justice served was the second. Suddenly, Charles's phone buzzed. His heart skipped a beat as he saw Sullivan's name flash across the screen. "Charles," Sullivan's voice crackled through the line, low and urgent. "It's done. The files are out. Every major outlet has it now. The New York Times, Reuters, even international press. It's everywhere." Charles exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest momentarily easing. "Good. How long before they start moving?" "They already are," Sullivan replied. "I've been monitoring chatter. Mason's people are scrambling, trying to contain it, but it's too big. There's no covering this up." Charles felt a small flicker of satisfaction. For the first time in weeks, it felt like they had the upper hand. What about the authorities? Are they moving in? Yes, Sullivan confirmed. The FBI is involved now, along with international agencies. They're going after everyone named in those files. It's going to take time, but they're making arrests. Mason's world is falling apart, but even as Sullivan spoke, Charles knew it wasn't over. Mason and his network weren't the kind of people to go quietly. They were cornered now, and that made them dangerous. And what about us? Charles asked, his voice lowering. How much time do we have? Sullivan hesitated. Not long. I've heard whispers that Mason knows you're behind this. He's going to come after you, Charles. He's not going to let you walk away from this. You and Amelia need to get out now. Charles swallowed hard, glancing at Amelia and Lily. He had known this moment was coming, but hearing Sullivan say it made the danger feel more real. We're leaving tonight, Charles said. Make sure everything is ready. It's all set, Sullivan assured him. I've got the plane waiting. Once you're in the air, you'll be safe. Charles hung up the phone and turned to Amelia. It's time. We need to go. Amelia nodded, her expression unreadable, but the fear was there, simmering beneath the surface. She looked at Lily, who was still sitting quietly, her eyes wide and anxious. Lily, honey, we have to leave now. Lily stood, her movements slow and heavy, as if the weight of everything they were facing was finally catching up to her. Where are we going? Charles hesitated for a moment, then spoke softly. Somewhere they can't find us. But we have to move fast. They gathered their things quickly, moving with a quiet urgency. Outside, the city was still alive, unaware of the battle being fought behind closed doors. Charles led the way down the hallway, his eyes scanning every shadow, every movement. He couldn't shake the feeling that Mason's men were already close. The elevator doors slid open, and they stepped inside, the air thick with tension. Charles's heart pounded in his chest as the elevator descended, the lights flickering slightly as they passed each floor. When the doors opened to the underground parking lot, the three of them stepped out cautiously. The black SUV Sullivan had arranged was parked at the far end of the lot. The driver, a trusted contact of Sullivan's, stood by the door, scanning the area. He gave Charles a quick nod as they approached. Everything ready? Charles asked, his voice low but urgent. Ready, the driver said, opening the door for them. Let's move. Amelia climbed into the back seat first, followed by Lily. As Charles turned to get in, something caught his eye, a flash of movement near the entrance to the lot. His blood ran cold. Figures moved in the shadows, creeping closer. Go, Charles shouted, diving into the SUV just as gunfire erupted behind them. The driver floored the gas pedal, and the SUV roared to life, speeding out of the parking lot as bullets ricocheted off the concrete walls. Charles twisted in his seat, his heart racing as he saw two black sedans give chase. The sound of tires screeching filled the air as they weaved through the streets, the city lights blurring into streaks of color. How did they find us? Amelia cried, her voice filled with panic. They must have been watching, Charles said through gritted teeth, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. They're not going to let us leave without a fight. The driver took a sharp turn, the SUV narrowly avoiding a collision with a parked car as they sped toward the freeway. Charles could see the black sedans gaining on them, their headlights glaring in the rearview mirror. His mind raced, searching for a way out. They couldn't outrun them forever. Suddenly, the driver swerved, taking an off-ramp that led them into a maze of narrow side streets. The sedans followed, their engines roaring as they closed in. Charles felt his pulse quicken. This was it. They were running out of time. Hold on, the driver shouted, his hands gripping the wheel tightly as he made another sharp turn. The SUV skidded, tires screeching as they raced down a narrow alleyway. The sedans followed, but as they turned the corner, the first one slammed into a pile of debris, the screech of metal against metal echoing through the alley. One down, Charles muttered, but the second sedan was still on their tail. The alley opened up into a side street, and the SUV shot out into the open road, speeding toward the freeway. The last sedan was still close behind, its engine roaring as it tried to keep pace. Suddenly, the freeway ramp came into view, and the SUV accelerated, merging onto the open highway. Charles glanced in the rearview mirror. The sedan was still there, but they were gaining distance. As they sped down the freeway, the city lights fading behind them, Charles finally allowed himself to breathe. The danger wasn't over, but they were getting away. "We're almost there," the driver said, his voice steady. "Once we get to the airport, we'll be safe." Amelia reached for Charles's hand, squeezing it tightly. "We did it," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "We're going to make it." Charles nodded, though his mind was still racing. They had made it out for now, but he knew the fight wasn't over. Mason and his people were still out there, and they wouldn't stop until they had silenced everyone who knew the truth. But for the first time in a long time, Charles felt hope. They had exposed the conspiracy. The world knew now, and no matter how hard Mason tried, he couldn't stop what was coming. As the SUV approached the private airport, Charles glanced back at Lily, who was staring out the window, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "We're safe now," Charles said softly, though he knew the road ahead would still be dangerous. "We'll start over. Somewhere new. Together." Lily smiled weakly, nodding. "That's all I want." The SUV pulled into the airport, where a small jet waited on the tarmac. As they stepped out of the car, Charles looked up at the sky, the stars twinkling above. For the first time in years, the weight of the past seemed to lift. He had lost so much, but now, with Amelia and Lily by his side, he had a chance to rebuild. As they boarded the plane, Charles took one last look at the city behind them. The fight wasn't over, but the truth was out there, and that was something Mason and his people could never take away. They had won the first battle, and as the plane soared into the night sky, Charles allowed himself a rare moment of peace. They were free now, ready to face whatever came next, together.